Traditions and Encounters, Chapter 14. I'm also reading Part 3, bringing it all together, as well as Part 4. Part 3, Post-Classical Era, 500 to 1000 CE. After the collapse of the classical societies in Persia, China, India, and the Mediterranean societies in much of the Eastern Hemisphere were faced with the monumental tasks of restoring internal order as well as rebuilding networks of contact and exchange that had fallen into disuse. Although the ways societies accomplished these tasks varied, it is nevertheless clear that large portions of Eurasia and North Africa once again came under stable rule between 500 and 1000 CE. As a consequence, during the post-classical era, much of the Eastern Hemisphere both reintegrated and enhanced the trade networks that had once linked so many of the classical societies. Religion played an important role in the maintenance of internal order, and most post-classical societies, including the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and India, Byzantine emperors claimed divine status within the Christian Orthodox Church, dramatically enhancing their authority among their subjects. In the Islamic world, the new Muslim faith provided a common language, doctrine, culture, and legal system that served to unite diverse conquered peoples in a common community of believers. In India, the caste system, central to Hinduism, linked cultural unity to the subcontinent, even though it was not ruled by a single power. Because the caste system determined the social role of both groups and individuals, it was a critical factor in maintaining a stable society. Once they had restored internal order, the post-classical societies reestablished and expanded the trade networks that had once linked the classical societies. This encouraged the exchange of goods, of course, but also encouraged the transfer of technologies and food items that allowed for improved agricultural practices and greater crop productivity, both of which led to population growth. As in the classical era, interaction triggered by trade was also accompanied by cultural interaction. The vast networks of roads and sea lanes that linked post-classical societies became highways for the exchange of ideas and beliefs as well. Of these myriad cultural interactions, the spread of religion, including Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Christianity, was perhaps the most obvious and important. In fact, each of these religions spread far beyond their origins in the post-classical era. As a result of Indian Ocean trade networks, Indian merchants brought Hinduism to much of Southeast Asia. Islamic traders from both India and Arabia later did the same with their faith. Meanwhile, Buddhists from India and Central Asia brought their faith to China, where for a time it enjoyed immense popularity. Finally, Orthodox Christians in Byzantine introduced their faith to the peoples of Eastern Europe, who adopted it as their own. As a result of these and other exchanges, the legacies of post-classical societies remain very much with us in the present day. Here is the graph chart, so you can kind of see. I will do a close this should you want to see the timeline. Sorry about that. Part 4, An Age of Cross-Cultural Interaction, 1000 to 1500 BC, or 1500 CE. Sorry about that. The half millennium from 1000 to 1500 CE differed markedly from earlier eras. During classical and post-classical times, large regional societies situated in China, India, Southwest Asia, and the Mediterranean basin dominated the Eastern Hemisphere from 1000 to 1500 CE. However, nomadic Turkish and Mongol peoples overran settled societies and established vast trans-regional empires from China to Eastern Europe. Here's a 13th century painting. The chapters. Effects of nomadic invasions. Nomadic peoples toppled several post-classical states, most notably the Song Empire in China and the Abbasid realm in Southwest Asia, by building empires that transcended the boundaries of post-classical states. However, nomadic Turks and Mongols laid a political foundation for sharply increased trade and communication between peoples of different societies and cultural regions. Economic integration. Let's see if I can scoot this forward. In the Indian Ocean Basin. Increased trade in the Indian Ocean Basin also promoted more intense cross-cultural communications. Maritime trade built on the political stability, economic expansion, and demographic growth of the post-classical era. This trade indicated a movement toward economic integration as societies of the Indian Ocean Basin concentrated increasingly on cultivating crops or producing goods for export while importing foods or goods that they could not produce very well themselves. Integration of peripheral regions. Demographic growth, economic expansion, and increased trade were not limited to the Indian Ocean Basin. Indeed, the Indian Ocean Basin, China and Southwest Asia. In this period, indeed, the intensification of trade across much of Eurasia also brought relatively isolated areas like sub-Saharan Africa and Western Europe into sustained cross-cultural relationships with far distant places. These relationships brought increased prosperity to both regions, which in turn encouraged political centralization and the consolidation of state power. Centralization in the Americas and Oceania. The indigenous peoples of the Americas and Oceania also built larger and more centralized societies from 1000 to 1500 CE, with centralized empires appearing in Mesoamerica and Andean South America, and agricultural societies emerging several regions of North America. Although Pacific Islanders had limited resources with which to build empires within their own agricultural and fishing societies, they established tightly centralized kingdoms. Turmoil in the Eastern Hemisphere. During the 14th and 15th centuries CE, much of the Eastern Hemisphere experienced difficulties not only because of warfare arising from conquest of nomadic peoples, but also because of epidemic bubonic plague and global climatic changes that brought cooler temperatures. Together, these problems led to political, social, and economic turmoil throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere, linking Afro-Asia, Eurasia, and the Americas. Nevertheless, by the mid-15th century, peoples from China to Western Europe were recovering from those difficulties and rebuilding prosperous societies in their own quest for prosperity. Western European peoples unwittingly laid the foundations of a new era in world history. While searching for sea routes to Asian markets, European mariners happened on the continents of North and South America. Their voyages brought about the world's various peoples for the first time into permanent and sustained communication, and their interactions triggered a series of consequences that profoundly influenced modern world history. Yet it is important to remember that the European voyages that gave rise to this interdependent and interconnected world occurred precisely because Europeans were seeking to become more involved in the vibrant trade networks that characterized much of the Eastern Hemisphere in the half millennium after 1000 CE. Number one, what were some of the positive and negative effects of the nomadic invasions that occurred after 1000 CE? Number two, what might have been some of the long-term effects of European mariners linking Afro-Eurasia with the Americas. Chapter 14, Nomadic Empires and the Eurasian Integration. Eyewitness, the goldsmith of the Mongolian steppe. Guillaume Boucher, a goldsmith who lived during the early and middle decades of the 13th century. During the 1230s, he left his native Paris and went to Budapest, which was then a part of the Kingdom of Hungary. There he was captured by Mongol warriors campaigning in Hungary. The Mongols noticed and appreciated Boucher's talents, and that when they left Hungary in 1242, they took him and other skilled captives to their Central Asian homeland. For at least the next 15 years, Boucher lived at the Mongol capital at Karakoram. Though technically a slave, he enjoyed some prestige. He supervised 50 assistants in a workshop that produced decorative objects of gold and silver for the Mongol court. His most ingenious creation was a spectacular silver fountain in the form of a tree. 4 pipes concealed by the tree's trunk carried wines and other intoxicating drinks to the top of the tree and then dispensed them into silver bowls from which the guests filled their cups. Apart from his famous fountain, Boucher also produced statues in gold and silver, built carriages, designed buildings, and even sewed ritual garments for Roman Catholic priests who conducted services for Christians living at Karakoram. Boucher was by no means the only European living at the Mongol court. His wife, was a woman of French ancestry whom Boucher had met and married in Hungary. The Flemish missionary William of Ruberg visited Karakoram in 1254, and during his sojourn there he encountered men and women from France, Russia, Greece, and England. Other European visitors to the Mongol court found Germans, Slavs, and Hungarians, as well as Chinese, Koreans, Turks, Persians, and Armenians. Among others, many 13th century roads led to Karakoram. Nomadic peoples had made their influence felt throughout much of Eurasia as early as classical times. The Xiongnu Confederation dominated Central Asia and threatened the Han Dynasty in China from the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE. During the 2nd and 3rd century CE, the Huns and other nomadic peoples from Central Asia launched migrations that helped bring down the Western Roman Empire, and later migrations of the White Huns destroyed the Gupta state in India. Turkish peoples ruled a large Central Asian empire from the 6th through the 9th century. In the Uyghur Turks even seized the capital of cities of the Tang dynasty in the mid-7th century. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, nomadic peoples became more prominent than ever before Eurasian affairs. Turkish peoples migrated to Persia, Anatolia, and India, where they established new states during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongols established themselves as the most powerful people of the Central Asian steppes and then turned on settled societies in China, Persia, Russia, and Eastern Europe. By the early 14th century, the Mongols had built the largest empire the world has ever seen, stretching from Korea and China in the east to Russia and Hungary in the west. Most of the Mongol states collapsed during the late 14th and 15th centuries, but the decline of the Mongols did not signal the end of nomadic peoples' influence on Eurasian affairs. Although a native I am so sorry, I don't see how this is going. Although a native Chinese dynasty replaced the Mongol state in China. The Mongols continued to threaten its Central Asian frontier. Moreover, from the 14th through the 17th century, Turkish peoples embarked on new campaigns of expansion that eventually brought most of India, much of Central Asia, all of Anatolia, and a good portion of Eastern Europe under their domination. The military campaigns of nomadic peoples were sometimes exceedingly destructive. Nomadic warriors demolished cities, slaughtered urban populations, and ravaged surrounding agricultural lands. Yet those same forces also encouraged systematic, peaceful interaction between peoples of different societies between the 11th and 15th century. The imperial campaigns of Turkish and Mongol peoples forged closer links than ever before between Eurasian lands. By fostering cross-cultural communication and exchange on an unprecedented scale, the nomadic empires integrated the lives of peoples throughout much of the Eastern Hemisphere. Here's the chronology. Turkish migrations and imperial expansion. Turkish peoples never formed a single homogeneous group, but rather organized themselves into clans and tribes that often fought bitterly with one another. All Turkish peoples spoke related languages, and all were nomads or descendants of nomads. From modest beginnings, they expanded their influence until they dominated not only the steppes of Central Asia, but also settled societies in Persia, Anatolia, and India. Nomadic economy and society. Nomadic societies in Central Asia developed by adapting to the ecological conditions of arid lands. Central Asia does not receive enough rain to support large-scale agriculture. Oases permit cultivation of limited regions, but for the most part, only grasses and shrubs grow on the Central Asian steppe lands, and there are no large rivers or other source of water to support large-scale irrigation systems. Yet grazing animals thrive on grasses and shrubs, and the peoples of Central Asia took advantage of this by herding sheep, horses, cattle, goat, and camels. Nomadic peoples and their animals. Nomadic people drove their herds and flocks to lands with abundant grass and then moved them along as the animals thinned the vegetation. They carefully followed migratory cycles that took account of the seasons and local climatic conditions and lived mostly off of meat, milk, and the hides of their animals. They used animal bones for tools and animal dung as fuel. They made shoes and clothes out of the wool from their sheep and skins from their other animals. Their dwellings, large tents called yurts, were fashioned with felt made from wool of their sheep. They even prepared an alcoholic drink from their animals by fermenting mare's milk into a potent concoction known as kumis. Nomadic and settled peoples. The aridity of the climate and nomadic lifestyle limited the development of human societies in Central Asia. Intensive agriculture was impossible except in oases, and the need to regularly follow the herds made large-scale craft production impractical. As a result, nomads avidly sought opportunities to trade with settled peoples. Much of that commerce took place on a small scale as nomads sought agricultural products and manufactured goods to satisfy their immediate needs. Often, however, nomads also participated in long-distance trade networks because of their mobility and their familiarity with large regions of Central Asia. Nomadic peoples were ideally suited to organize and lead caravans that crossed Central Asia and linked settled societies from China to the Mediterranean basin. During the post-classical era and later, Turkish people were especially prominent on the caravan routes of Central Asia. Here's sources from the past, so that you can pause and read at your leisure. Sorry. Nomadic society. Nomadic society generated two social classes, elites and commoners. Charismatic leaders won recognition as elites and thereby acquired the prestige needed to organize clans and tribes into alliances. Normally, elites did little governing, since clans and tribes looked after their own affairs and resented interference. During times of war, however, elites wielded absolute authority over the forces within their alliances. Their nomadic nobility was a fluid class. Leaders passed elite status along to their heirs, but their heirs could lose their status if they could not continue to provide appropriate leadership for their clans and tribes. Over the course of a few generations, elites could return to the status of commoners. Meanwhile, commoners could win recognition as elites by outstanding conduct, particularly by courageous behavior during war. Then, if they were clever diplomats, they could arrange alliances between clans and tribes and gain enough support to displace established leaders. Nomadic religion. The earliest religion of the Turkish peoples revolved around shamans, religious specialists who possessed supernatural powers, communicated with the gods and nature spirits, and invoked divine aid on behalf of their communities. Yet many Turkish peoples became attracted to the religious and cultural traditions they encountered when trading with peoples of settled societies. And by the 6th century CE, many Turks had converted to Buddhism, Nestorian Christianity, or Manichaeism, partly because of their newly adopted religious traditions and partly because of their prominence in Eurasian trade networks. Turkish peoples also developed a written script. Turkish conversion to Islam. Between the 10th and 14th century, most Turkish clans on the steppes of Central Asia converted to Islam. Their conversion had great significance. When Turkish peoples began to migrate into settled societies in large numbers, they helped spread Islam to new lands, particularly Anatolia and northern India. The boundaries of Islamic world thus expanded along the political and military influence of Turkish peoples. Military organization. The expansion took place when nomadic leaders, vast confederations of peoples under the leadership of Khan, the ruler. In fact, Khans rarely ruled directly, instead ruling through the leaders of allied tribes. Yet when organized on a large scale, nomadic peoples wielded enormous military power due mostly to their outstanding cavalry forces. Nomadic warriors had superior equestrian skills. Their arrows flew with deadly accuracy, even when launched from the backs of galloping horses. Moreover, units of warriors coordinated their movements to outmaneuver and overwhelm their opponents. Indeed, few armies were able to resist the mobility and discipline of well-organized nomadic warriors. With such military capabilities, several groups of Turkish nomads began in the 10th century CE to seize the wealth of settled societies and build imperial states in the regions surrounding Central Asia. Turkish empires in Persia, Anatolia, and India. Seljuk Turks and the Abbasid Empire. Turkish peoples entered Persia, Anatolia, and India at different times and for different purposes. They approached Abbasid Persia much as Germanic peoples had earlier approached the Roman Empire from about the mid-8th century to the mid-10th century. Turkish peoples lived mostly on the borders of the Abbasid realm. By the mid-late to late 10th century, large numbers of the Seljuk Turks served in Abbasid armies and lived in the Abbasid realm itself. By the mid-11th century, the Seljuks overshadowed the Abbasid caliphs so much that in 1055 the caliph organized the Seljuk leader Tughril Beg as sultan chieftain. Tughril what first consolidated his hold on the Abbasid capital at Baghdad. Then he and his successors extended Turkish rule to Syria, Palestine, and other parts of the realm. For the last 2 centuries of the Abbasid state, the caliphs served only as figureheads. Actual governance lay in the hands of the Turkish sultans. Here is the map. Should you want to take a look at this, you can kind of see how much they conquered the homeland of the Turkish peoples. The Seljuk Turks and the Byzantine Empire. Some Seljuk Turks began to turn their attention to the rich land of Anatolia, and in the early 11th century they began migrating there in large numbers. In 1071, Seljuk forces inflicted a devastating defeat on the Byzantine army at Manzikert in eastern Anatolia and took the Byzantine emperor captive. Following that victory, Seljuks and other Turkish groups entered Anatolia almost at will. The peasants of Anatolia, who most resented their Byzantine overlords, tended to look on the Seljuks as liberators rather than as conquerors. The migrants thoroughly transformed Anatolia. Turkish groups displaced Byzantine authorities and set up their own political and social institutions. They levied taxes on the Byzantine church, restricted its activities, and sometimes confiscated church property. Meanwhile, they welcomed converts to Islam and made political, social, and economic opportunities available to them. By 1453, when Ottoman Turks captured the Byzantine capital at Constantinople, Byzantine and Christian Anatolia had become largely a Turkish and Islamic land. Oh boy, sorry. Some of these words. Ghaznavad Turks and the Sultanate of Delhi. While the Seljuks spearhead Turkish migrations in Abbasid, Persia, and Byzantine Anatolia, in the early 11th century, Muhammad of Ghazni led the Turkish Ghazanids of Afghanistan in raids on lucrative sites in northern India. Although their original goal was plunder, they gradually became more interested in a permanent rule. They asserted their authority first over the Punjab, and then over Gujarat and Bengal. By the 13th century, the Turkish Sultanate of Delhi claimed authority over all of northern India. Several of the Delhi sultans conceived plans to conquer southern India, but none was able to realize those ambitions. Indeed, the sultans faced constant challenges from Hindu princesses in neighboring lands, and they periodically had to defend their northern frontiers from new Turkish or Mongol invaders. They maintained an enormous army with large elephant corps, but these forces only enabled them to hold onto territories they already had. Turkish rule had great social and cultural implications in India, as it did in Anatolia. Muhammad of Ghazni was a zealous foe of Buddhism and Hinduism alike, and his forces stripped Buddhist and Hindu establishments of their wealth, destroyed their buildings, and often slaughtered their residents and attendants as well. As Muhammad and Ghazni's forces repressed Buddhism and Hinduism, they encouraged conversion to Islam and enabled their faith to establish a secure presence in northern India. This is thinking about traditions. Though undertaken by different groups and for different reasons, the Turkish conquest of Persia, Anatolia, and India represented part of a larger expansive movement by nomadic peoples.
In all three cases, the formidable military prowess of Turkish peoples enabled them to dominate settled societies. By the 13th century, the influence of nomadic peoples was greater than ever before in Eurasian history. Yet Turkish conquest represented only a prelude to an astonishing round of empire building launched by the Mongols during the 13th and 14th centuries. The Mongol empires. For most of their history, the nomadic Mongols lived on the high steppe lands of eastern Central Asia. Like other nomadic peoples, they displayed deep loyalty to kin groups organized into families, clans, and tribes. They frequently allied with the Turkish peoples who built empires on the steppes, but they rarely played a leading role in the organization of states before the 13th century. Strong loyalties to kinship groups made it difficult for the Mongols to organize a stable society on a large scale. During the early 13th century, however, Genghis Khan, sometimes spelled Genghis Khan, forged the various Mongol tribes into a powerful alliance that built the largest empire the world has ever seen. Although the vast Mongol realm soon dissolved into a series of smaller empires, most of which disappeared within a century, the Mongols' imperial venture brought the societies of Eurasia into closer contact than ever before. Genghis Khan and the making of the Mongol power. Chinggis. I guess it's pronounced Chinggis. I will pronounce it Genghis. The unifier of the Mongols was Timuchin, born about 1167 into a noble family. His father was a prominent warrior who forged an alliance between several Mongol clans and seconds likely to become a powerful leader. When Timuchin was about 10 years old, however, rivals poisoned his father and destroyed the alliance. Abandoned by his father's allies, Timuchin led a precarious existence for some years. He lived in poverty since rivals seized the family's animals and several times eluded enemies seeking to eliminate him. A rival once captured him and imprisoned him in a wooden cage, but Timuchin made a daring midnight escape and regained his freedom. Genghis Khan rise to power. During the late 12th century, Timuchin made an alliance with a prominent Mongol clan leader. He also mastered the art of steppe diplomacy, which called for displays of personal courage in battle. Combined with the intense loyalty to allies, a willingness to betray others to improve one's position, and the ability to entice other tribes into cooperative relationships, Timuchin gradually strengthened his position, sometimes by forging useful alliances, often by conquering rival contenders for power, and occasionally by turning suddenly against troublesome ally. He eventually brought all the Mongol tribes into a single confederation, and in 1206, an assembly of Mongol leaders recognized Timucin's supremacy by proclaiming him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. Mongol political organization. Genghis Khan's policies greatly strengthened the Mongol people. Earlier nomadic state builders had ruled largely through the leaders of allied tribes, but Genghis Khan mistrusted the Mongols' tribal organization. So he broke up the tribes and forced men of fighting age to join new military units with no tribal affiliations. He chose high military and political officials not on the basis of kinship or tribal status, but because of their talents or their loyalty to him. Although he spent most of his life on horseback, Genghis Khan also established a capital of Karakorum, present-day Har-Haran, located about 300 kilometers, 186 miles, west of the modern Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar, where he built a luxurious palace as command center of Chinggis Khan's empire. Karakoram symbolized a source of Mongol authority superior to the clan or tribe. Chinggis Khan's policies created a Mongol state that was not only much stronger than earlier nomadic confederation, but also less troubled by conflicts between clans and tribes. The most important institution of the Mongol state was the army, which magnified the power of the small population. In the 13th century, the Mongol population stood at about 1 million people, less than 1% of China's numbers during the Chinggis Khan's life. His army numbered only 100,000 to 125,000 Mongols, although allied peoples also contributed forces. How is it possible for so few people to conquer the better part of Eurasia? Here's a picture of Genghis Khan. Mongol arms. Like earlier nomadics, Mongol forces relied on outstanding equestrian skills. In addition, their bows were short enough for archers to use while riding, and their arrows could fell enemies at 200 meters, which is 656 feet. Mongol horsemen were among the most mobile forces of the pre-modern world, sometimes traveling more than 100 kilometers, which is 62 miles per day, to surprise an enemy. Furthermore, the Mongols understood the psychological dimensions of warfare and used them to their advantage. If enemies surrounded without resistance, the Mongols usually spared their lives, and they provided generous treatment for artisan craft workers and those with military skills. In the event of resistance, however, the Mongols ruthlessly slaughtered whole populations, sparing only a few, whom they sometimes drove before their armies as human shields during future conflicts. Once he had united the Mongols, Genghis Khan turned his army and his attention to other parts of Central Asia, particularly to nearby settled societies. He attacked the various Turkish peoples ruling in Tibet, northern China, Persia, and the Central Asian steppes. Those conquests were important because they protected him against the possibility that other nomadic leaders might challenge his rule. But the Mongol campaigns in China and Persia had especially far-reaching consequences. The conquest of China was important even in terms of the development of the Mongol arms. Indeed, Mongol invaders learned about gunpowder from Chinese military engineers in the early 13th century and soon incorporated gunpowder-based weapons into their arsenal. During the 1250s, as they campaigned in Persia and Southwest Asia, the Mongols used catapults and trebuchets to lob gunpowder bombs into cities under siege. Muslim armies soon developed similar weapons in response. These weapons quickly spread to Europe in the mid-13th century, and thus Mongols were critical not only for efficiency using gunpowder weapons in military campaigns, but also for diffusing a technology that forever changed the nature of warfare. Mongol conquest of northern China. Genghis Khan himself extended Mongol rule to northern China, dominated since 1127 by the nomadic Jurchen people, while the Song dynasty continued to rule in southern China. In 1211 CE, Mongol raiding parties invaded Jurchen realm, and by 1215 the Mongols had captured the capital near modern Beijing. This city, under the new name of Khanbalik, city of the Khan, also served as the Mongol capital in China. By 1220, the Mongols had largely established control over northern China. Mongol conquest of Persia. Next, Genghis Khan led another force to Afghanistan, and Persia ruled at that time. by a successor to the Seljuks, known as the Khwarazm Shah. The mission was one of revenge, for in 1218 the Khwarazm Shah had spurned a diplomatic envoy sent by Chinggis Khan by murdering the whole group. In response, the following year, Chinggis took his army west, pursued the Khwarazm Shah to an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died, shattered his army, and seized control of his realm. To ensure that the Shah's state would never constitute a challenge to his own empire, Chinggis Khan wreaked destruction on the conquered land. The Mongols ravaged one city after another, demolishing buildings and massacring hundreds of thousands of people. Some cities never recovered. The Mongols also destroyed the delicate Quinault irrigation system that sustained agriculture in the arid region, resulting in severely reducing agricultural production. For centuries after the Mongol conquest, Persian chroniclers cursed the invaders and devastation they visited on the land. By the time of his death in 1227, Chinggis Khan had laid the foundation of a vast and mighty empire. He had united the Mongols, established Mongol supremacy in Central Asia, and extended Mongol control to northern China in the east and Persia in the west. But Chinggis Khan was a conqueror, not an administrator. He ruled the Mongols themselves through his control over the army, but he did not establish a central government for the lands that he conquered. Instead, he assigned Mongol overlords to supervise local administrators and to extract a generous tribute for the Mongols' own uses. Chinggis Khan's heirs continued his conquest, but they also undertook the task of designing a more permanent administration to guide the fortunes of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol empires after Chinggis Khan. Chinggis Khan's death touched off a struggle for power among his sons and grandsons. Eventually, his heirs divided Chinggis Khan's vast realm into 4 regional empires. The great Khans ruled China, the wealthiest of the Mongol lands, descendant of Chagatai, one of the Chinggis Khan's sons, ruled the Khanate of the Chagatai in Central Asia. Persia fell under the authority of rulers known as the Ilkhans, and the Khans of the Golden Horde dominated Russia. The great Khans were nominally superior to the others, but they were rarely able to enforce their claims to authority. In fact, for as long as the Mongols survived, ambition fueled constant tension and occasional conflict among the 4 Khans. Kublai Khan. The consolidation of Mongol rule in China came during the reign of Kublai, sometimes spelled Kublai, one of Chinggis Khan's grandsons. Kublai was perhaps the most talented of the great conquerors' descendants. He unleashed ruthless attacks against his enemies, but he also took an interest in cultural matters and worked to improve the welfare of his subjects. He actively promoted Buddhism, and he provided support for Taoist, Muslims, and Christians in his realm. The famous Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who lived almost 2 decades at Kublai's court, praised him for his generosity toward the poor and his efforts to build roads. From 1264 until his death in 1294, Kublai Khan presided over the Mongol Empire at its height. Mongol conquest of southern China, Kublai extended Mongol rule to all of China from his base Khanbalik. He relentlessly attacked the Song dynasty in southern China. The Song capital of Hangzhou fell to Mongol forces in 1276, and within 3 years, Kublai had eliminated resistance throughout China. In 1279, he proclaimed himself emperor and established the Yan dynasty, which ruled China until the collapse in 1368. Beyond China, Kublai had little success as conqueror. During the 1270s and 1280s, he launched several unsuccessful invasions of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Burma, as well as failed naval expedition against Java involving 500 to 1,000 ships and 20,000 troops. In 1274 and again in 1281, Kublai also attempted seaborne invasions of Japan, but on both occasions typhoons thwarted his plans. The storm of 1281 was especially vicious. It destroyed about 4,500 Mongol vessels carrying more than 100,000 troops, the largest seaborne expedition before World War II. The Golden Horde. As Kublai consolidated his hold on East Asia, his cousins and brothers tightened Mongol control on lands to the west. Mongols of the groups known as the Golden Horde overran Russia between 1237 and 1241, and then mounted exploratory expeditions into Poland, Hungary, and eastern Germany. In 1241 and 1242, Mongols of the Golden Horde prized the steppes north of the Black Sea as prime pasture land for their horses, and they used them to maintain a large army. They did not occupy Russia, which they regarded as an unattractive land of forest, but they extracted tribute from the Russian cities and agricultural provinces. The Golden Horde maintained its hegemony in Russia until mid-15th century, when the princes of Moscow built a powerful Russian state. By the mid-16th century, Russian conquerors had extended their control to the steppes, but Mongol Khans descended from the Golden Horde continued to rule the Crimea until the late 18th century. The Ilkhanate of Persia. While the Golden Horde established its authority in Russia, Kublai's brother Hugli toppled the Abbasid Empire and established the Mongol Ilkhanate, in Persia. Oh boy. In 1258, he captured the Abbasid capital of Baghdad after a brief siege. His troops looted the city, executed the caliph, and massacred more than 200,000 residents from Persia. Hugu's army ventured into Syria, but Muslim forces from Egypt soon expelled them and placed a limit on Mongol expansion to the southwest. When the Mongols crushed ruling regimes in large settled societies, they discovered that they needed to become governors as well as conquerors. The Mongols had no experience administering complex societies where successful governance required talents beyond the equestrian and military skills esteemed on the steppes. They had a difficult time adjusting to their role as administrators, and in fact, most of their conquests fell out of their hands within a century. Here is how much of Khanbalik was taken during the capital. And here's the Khan of the four brothers. Mongol rule in Persia. The Mongols adopted different tactics in the different lands they ruled. In Persia, they made important concessions to local interest. Although Mongols and their allies occupied the highest administrative positions, they basically allowed the Persians to run the Khanate as long as they delivered tax receipts and maintained order. Over time, the Mongols even assimilated to Persian cultural traditions. The early Mongol rulers of Persia mostly observed their native shamanism, but they tolerated all religions, including Islam, Nestorian Christianity, Buddhism, and Judaism. Gradually, however, the Mongols gravitated toward Islam. In 1295, Ilkrim Ghazin publicly converted to Islam, and most of the Mongols in Persia followed his example. Ghazin's conversion sparked large-scale massacres of Christians and Jews, and it signaled the absorption of the Mongols into Muslim Persian society. Mongol rule in China. In China, in contrast, the Mongol overlords stood aloof from their subjects, whom they scorned as mere cultivators. They outlawed intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese and forbade the Chinese to learn the Mongol language. Some of the victors went so far as to suggest that the Mongols exterminate the Chinese people and convert China itself into pasture land for their horses. In the end, the Mongols decided simply to extract as much revenue as possible from their Chinese subjects. Unlike their counterparts in Persia, the Mongols in China did not make much use of native administrative talent. Instead, they brought foreign administrators, including Arabs, Persians, and even Europeans, into China and placed them in charge. The Mongols also resisted assimilation to Chinese cultural traditions. They ended the privileges enjoyed by the Confucian scholars, and they dismantled the Confucian educational and examination system, which had produced generations of civil servants for the Chinese. Here's the siege of Baghdad. Bureaucracy. They did not persecute Confucians, but they allowed the Confucian tradition to wither in the absence of official support. Meanwhile, although the Mongols mostly continued to follow their native shamanistic cults, they tolerated all cultural and religious traditions in China, including Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Christianity. Of Kublai Khan's 4 wives, his favorite was Chapt, a Nestorian Christian. The Mongols and Eurasian integration. In building their vast empire, the Mongols brought tremendous destruction to land throughout much of the Eurasian landmass. Yet they also sponsored interaction among peoples of different societies and linked Eurasian lands more directly than ever before. Indeed, Mongol rulers positively encouraged travel and communication over long distances, recognizing the value of regular communication for their vast empire. Genghis Khan and his successors maintained a courier network that rapidly relayed news, information, and government orders. The network included relay stations with fresh horses and riders so that messages could travel almost nonstop throughout Mongol territories. The Mongols' encouragement of travel and communication facilitated trade, diplomatic travel, missionary efforts, and movements of peoples to new lands. The Mongols in trade. As a nomadic people dependent on commerce with settled agricultural societies, the Mongols worked to secure trade routes and ensure the safety of merchants passing through their territories. The Mongol Khans frequently fought among themselves, but they maintained reasonably good order within their realms and allowed merchants to travel unmolested through their empires. As a result, long-distance travel and trade became much less riskier than in earlier times. Merchants increased their commercial investments, and the volume of long-distance trade across Central Asia dwarfed that of earlier eras. Lands as distant as China and Western Europe became directly linked for the first time because of the ability to travel across the entire Eurasian landmass. Here is for Pax Mongoliaca. Diplomatic missions, like trade, diplomatic communication was essential to the Mongols, and their protection of the roads and travelers benefited ambassadors as well as merchants throughout the Mongol era. The Great Khan of in China, the Ilkhans in Persia, and other Khans maintained close communication by means of diplomatic embassies. They also had diplomatic dealings with rulers in Korea, Vietnam, India, and Western Europe, and in other lands as well. Some diplomatic travelers crossed the entire Eurasian landmass. Several European ambassadors traveled to Mongolia and China to deliver messages from authorities seeking to ally with the Mongols against Muslim states. In Southwest Asia, diplomats also traveled west. Rabban Suma, a Nestorian Christian monk born in Kambalik, visited Italy and France as a representative of the Persian Ilkhan missionary efforts. Like the Silk Roads in earlier times, Eurasian routes during the era of the Mongol empires served as a highway for missionaries as well as merchants and diplomats. Sufi missionaries helped popularize Islam among Turkish peoples in Central Asia, and Nestorian Christians found new opportunities to win converts when they went to China to serve as administrators for Mongol rulers. Roman Catholic Christians also mounted missionary campaigns in China. See Chapter 18 for further discussion of travel during Mongol era. Resettlement, another Mongol policy that encouraged Eurasian integration, was the practice of resettling peoples in new lands. As a nomadic people, the Mongols had limited numbers of skilled artisans and educated individuals, but the more their empire expanded, the more they needed the services of specialized craft workers and literate administrators. Mongol overlords recruited the talent they needed largely from the ranks of their allies and the peoples they conquered, and they often moved people far from their homelands to sites where they could best make use of their services. Among the most important of the Mongols' allies were the Uyghur Turks, who lived mostly in oasis cities along the Silk Roads. The Uyghurs were literate and often highly educated, and they provided not only many of the clerks, secretaries, and administrators who ran the Mongol empires, but also units of soldiers who bolstered Mongol garrisons. Arab and Persian Muslims who were also prominent among those who administered the Mongols' affairs far from their homelands. Conquered peoples also supplied the Mongols with talent. When they overcome a city, Mongol forces surveyed the captured population, separated out those with specialized skill, and sent them where there was demand for their services. After the 1230s, the Mongol often took censuses of lands they conquered, partly to levy taxes and conscript military forces, and partly to locate talented individuals. The Parisian goldsmith Guillaume Boucher was only one of among thousands of foreign-born individuals who became permanent residents of the Mongol capital at Karakoram. Because of their special talents, like their protection of trade and diplomacy, the Mongols' policy of resettling allies and conquered peoples promoted Eurasian integration by increasing communication and exchange between peoples of different societies. I'll go ahead and close in on the reverberations. The decline of the Mongols in Persia and China. Collapse of the Incanate soon after the long and prosperous reign of Kublai Khan, the Mongols encountered serious difficulties governing Persia and China. In Persia, excessive spending strained the treasury, and over-exploitation of the peasantry led to reduced revenues. When the Eli Khan tried to resolve his financial difficulties by ordering the use of paper money in the 1290s, merchants refused to accept paper they regarded as worthless. Commerce ground to a halt until the Ukuran rescinded his order. Meanwhile, factional struggles plagued the Mongol leadership. When the last of the Mongol rulers died without an heir in 1335, the Ilkhanate itself simply collapsed. Government in Persia devolved to local levels until late in the 14th century, when Turkish peoples reintroduced effective central government. Decline of the Yuan dynasty. Mongol decline in China was a more complicated affair. As in Persia, it had economic dimension. The Mongols continued to use paper money that the Chinese had introduced during the Tang and Song dynasties, but they did not maintain adequate reserves of the bullion that backed up paper notes. The general population soon lost confidence in paper money, and its value plummeted. As in Persia, too, factions and infighting hastened Mongol decline in China. Beginning in the 1320s, power struggles, imperial assassinations, and civil war convulsed the Mongol regime in China. The bubonic plague. Apart from financial difficulties and factional divisions, the Mongol rulers of China also faced an onslaught of epidemic disease. By facilitating trade and communications throughout Eurasia, the Mongols unwittingly expedited the spread of the bubonic plague, discussed in Chapter 18. During the 1330s, plague erupted in southwestern China. From there, it spread throughout China and Central Asia, and by the late 1340s, it had reached Southwest Asia and Europe, where it became known as the Black Death. Bubonic plague sometimes killed half or more of an exposed population, particularly during the furious initial years of the epidemic, and it seriously disrupted economies and societies throughout much of Eurasia. In China, depopulation and labor shortages that followed on the heels of the epidemic plague weakened the Mongol regime. Because they treated their Chinese subjects as inferiors, the Mongols also faced rebellious subject population in China. Beginning in the 1340s, southern China became a hotbed of peasant rebellion and banditry, which the Mongols could not control. In 1368, rebel forces captured Khan Balik, and the Mongols departed China in Massé and returned to the steppes. Surviving the Mongol Khanates. Despite the collapse of the Mongol regime in Persia and China, Mongol states did not completely disappear. The Khanate of the Chagatai continued to prevail in Central Asia, and Mongols posed a threat to the northwestern border of China until the 18th century. Meanwhile, the Khanate of the Golden Horde continued to dominate the Caucasus on the steppe lands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea until the mid-16th century, when a resurgent Russian state brought the Golden Horde down. Like Mongols in China, however, Mongols in Russia continued to threaten until the 18th century, and the Mongols who had settled in the Crimean Peninsula retained their identity until Joseph Stalin forcibly moved them to other parts of the Soviet Union in the mid-20th century. Okay, go ahead and take a look at the map. After the Mongols. By no means did the Mongols did the decline of the Mongols signal the end of nomadic peoples and influence in Eurasia. As Mongols' strength waned, Turkish peoples resumed the expansive campaigns that the Mongols had interrupted during the late 14th century and early 15th century. The Turk-Mongol conqueror Tamerlane built a Central Asian empire rivaling that of Genghis Khan himself. Although Tamerlane's empire founded soon after his death, it deeply influenced three surviving Turkish Muslim states: the Mughal Empire in India, the Safavid Empire in Persia, and the Ottoman Empire based in Anatolia, and embraced much of Southwest Asia, Southeastern Europe, and North Africa. Tamerlane and the Timurids. The lame conqueror, the rapid collapse of the Mongol states left gaping power vacuums in China and Persia. While the native Ming dynasty filled the vacuum in China, a self-made Turkic Mongol conqueror named Timur moved on Persia because he walked with a limp. Contemporaries referred to him as Timuri the Lame, an appellation that made its way into English as Tamerlane. Born in 1336 near Samarkand, Tamerlane took Genghis Khan as his model. Like Genghis Khan, Tamerlane came from a family of the minor Mongol and Turkish elites and had to make his own way to power. Also, like Genghis Khan, he was a charismatic leader and a courageous warrior, and he attracted a band of loyal followers. During the 1360s, he eliminated rivals to power either by persuading them to join him as allies or by defeating their armies on the battlefield, and he won recognition as leader of his own tribe. By 1370, he had extended his authority throughout the Khanate and the Chagatai and had begun to build a magnificent imperial capital in Samarkand. For the rest of his life, Tamerlane led his armies in campaigns of conquest. He turned first to the region between Persia and Afghanistan, and he took special care to establish his authority in the rich cities so that he could levy taxes on trade and agricultural production. Next, he attacked the Golden Horde in the Caucasus region and Russia and led the mid-1390s. He had severely weakened it. During the last years of the century, he invaded India and subjected Delhi to a ferocious sack. Later, Tamerlane campaigned along the Ganges. Although he never attempted to incorporate India into his empire, he opened the new century with campaigns in Southwest Asia and Anatolia. In 1404, he began preparations for an invasion of China, and he was leading his army east when he fell ill and died in 1405. Like his model Genghis Khan, Tamerlane was conqueror, not a governor. He spent most of his adult life planning and fighting military campaigns. He did not create an imperial administration, but rather ruled through tribal leaders who were his allies. He appointed overlords in the territories he conquered, but they relied on existing bureaucratic structures and simply received taxes and tributes on his behalf. Here is Tamerlane's tomb. Tamerlane's heirs. Given its loose organization, it is not surprising that Tamerlane's Timurid empire experienced stresses and strains after the conqueror's death. Tamerlane's sons and grandsons engaged in a long series of bitter conflicts that resulted in the contraction of the Timurid Empire and its division into four main regions. For a century after Tamerlane's death, however, they maintained control over the region from Persia to Afghanistan. When the vast vestiges of Tamerlane's imperial creation disappeared in the early 16th century, the Mughal, Safavid, and the Ottoman empires that replaced it all clearly reflected the Turkish, Mongol, and Muslim legacy of the lame conqueror. The foundation of the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 24 will discuss the Mughal Empire in India and the Safavid Empire in Persia, both of which emerged during the early 16th centuries as Tamerlane's empire finally dissolved. The early stages of the Ottoman expansion predated Tamerlane, however, and the foundation of the influential Ottoman Empire throws additional light on the influence of nomadic peoples during the period 1000 to 1500 CE. Osman. After the Mongol conquest of Persia, large numbers of nomadic Turks migrated from Central Asia to Achaemenid and beyond it to the territories in Anatolia that the Seljuk Turks had seized from the Byzantine Empire. There they followed charismatic leaders who organized further campaigns of conquest. Among those leaders was Osman, who during the late 13th and early 14th centuries carved a small state for himself in northwestern Anatolia. In 1299, Osman declared independence from the Seljuk Sultan and launched a campaign to build a state at the expense of the Byzantine Empire. After every successful operation, Osman attracted more and more followers who came to be known as the Osmanlis, or the Ottomans. Ottoman conquest. During the 1350s, the Ottomans gained a considerable advantage over their Turkish rivals when they established a foothold across the Dardanelles at Jalapa on the Balkan Peninsula. The Ottomans quickly moved to expand the boundaries of their Balkan holdings. By the 1380s, they had become by far the most powerful people in the Balkan Peninsula, and by the end of the century, they were poised to capture Constantinople and take over the Byzantine Empire. Tamerlane temporarily delayed Ottoman expansion in the Byzantine realm. In 1402, his forces crushed the Ottoman Empire army, captured the Sultan, and subjected the Ottoman estate to the conqueror's authority. After Tamerlane's death, Ottoman leaders had to reestablish their rule in their own realm. Yet by the 1440s, the Ottomans had recovered their balance and had begun again to expand in the Byzantine Empire. The capture of Constantinople. The campaign culminated in 1453. The Sultan Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, captured the Byzantine city of Constantinople, thus bringing to an end more than 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. After subjecting it to a sack, he made the city his own capital under the Turkish name of Istanbul. With Istanbul as a base, the Ottomans quickly absorbed the remainder of the Byzantine Empire. By 1480, they controlled all of Greece and the Balkan region. They continued to expand throughout most of the 16th century as well, extending their rule to Southwest Asia, Southeastern Europe, Egypt, and North Africa. Once again, then, a nomadic people asserted control over long-settled society and quickly built a vast empire. This is the end of chapter 14.